Hello everyone, I need your assistance before we begin this narrative. We've discovered that many individuals stay until the very end. However, if you love these writings and would want to help the creators, please do not subscribe. It's difficult out here. It's far more helpful than you may imagine, so press the subscribe button, like the article and enable alerts. Now let's hello Reddit. I suppose I should begin by stating that I don't despise my brothers. It's not as if they harass me or anything, but I also don't consider them to be my brothers, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if they even consider me to be their brother. We have a mother in common, but they have their father, and I, Jake 16, have no one. Have 3 half-brothers, Khaled, who is my age, Tyler, who is 18, and Ethan, who is still very much in the photo. He buys them things, takes them on vacations, and is essentially a fantastic parent. My dad has no idea. I've never met him. I don't even know whether the name on my birth certificate is authentic, and I haven't received any birthday cards or phone calls. My brothers don't treat me badly. They don't prank me, force me into lockers, or do anything else like that. They just don't see, though I'll be in the same room as them. I'm not involved in their inside jokes, plans, or lifestyles. They're arranging a beach vacation with their dad and talking about how much fun it will be, like if I don't exist. And since I'm certain they won't ask if I want to attend, I'll simply sit there and listen. Mom doesn't get involved. I believe she simply believes that because there isn't any open conflict, we get along well. She works a lot and is always fatigued when she gets home. She usually watches TV, eats supper in her room, and it's strange because I don't believe she really realizes how isolated I am from the rest of the family until she goes to sleep watching TV, because I feel like I don't belong in this home with these people who are meant to be my family. My Uncle Dave is the only one who really cares about me. I'm simply the extra child who doesn't fit in. The only person that really listens to me when I chat and asks how I'm doing is my mom's brother, who works in it and makes nice. I feel like I have someone who really cares about me when they give me money and sometimes take me to basketball games. I try not to let it get to me since he cares, and once even got me a jersey, which is more than my own mother has done for me in years. To me, but it's difficult since I always stay at home and act like it's happening whenever my brothers go on a vacation with their dad. I act as if I don't mind, that I wasn't there every time I hear them laughing over an inside joke. But in all honesty, it's awful to feel that the lone member of your own family doesn't belong. Perhaps I'm overanalyzing it, or perhaps this is the way it is when you're the odd one out, but when Uncle Dave informed me he got tickets to the Bulls game in Chicago, I could hardly believe it. It's not just tickets, it's a whole vacation that includes flights, hotels, and incredible seats. I was flying for the first time, staying in a real hotel for the first time, and seeing the court for the first time. I felt like I had something to get enthusiastic about for once when I watched a live NBA game, so I counted down. I researched the stadium, the team, and even the hotel where we were staying, which had a rooftop pool. Had never ever seen a pool without being surrounded by yelling children from my area, much less one on a. It seemed like I was finally going to have one of those moments my brothers always spoke about on a rooftop in a major city. The night before, it was my turn to talk about the ones they received with their dad while I remained at home. Scheduled to depart, I packed everything, stayed up late, and was too thrilled to sleep, visualizing the trip, the city, game, but all went apart the next morning, and their father had to abandon his plans. I had no idea why, and to be honest, I didn't give a damn. All I knew was that my brothers had abruptly stopped going on their Uncle Dave, who is a fair and kind man, asked them if they wanted to go on a weekend vacation because they weren't going anyplace. When he asked, "Come with us," I knew they would answer, "Why wouldn't they?" Because it was a free game and a trip. Weekend, and suddenly my journey, my first true adventure, was theirs instead of mine, and I wanted to be happy. That while we were still moving ahead, the thrill was gone. I had been anticipating this for weeks, knowing it was anything unique for me that I didn't have to tell them about. I had pictured what it would be like to be the one. Now it was simply another vacation, another adventure, and for once, someone came home with a good narrative, would not. The last hotel where their father had brought them, even during the game where I was supposed to be. I was having a great time, but it seemed like I was just an extra in their experience. They hadn't done anything wrong. Didn't shove me aside or steal my seat. They just existed, and that was enough to spoil everything because rather than this was my recollection, and it was simply another activity we all performed together, although it wasn't really that much since I was never really a part of them, but I was just accompanying them on my own vacation, and I wanted to thank Uncle Dave even though I knew he didn't want to be disrespectful. But as I sat in that stadium and watched the game I had been fantasizing about for weeks, all I could think about was sore as hollow because, despite my best efforts, I was never able to have anything of my own, going to be theirs first, despite my best efforts to suppress my annoyance and the sensation of being invisible. Felt different this time, and Caleb, who usually seldom noted it, said so before we even departed for the airport. I believed he needed something when he knocked on my door while I was packing, outside of our scheduled encounters. I almost told him no out of habit, but he just leaned against the doorway and asked if I wanted assistance instead. Did not go. He took hold of my duffel bag and began folding some of my items, really assisting without being I inquired, keeping a close eye on him in case he pulled a practical joke, but he only offered assistance when I was unsure. He shrugged, not knowing what to say, and added, I thought we could all get ready quicker if we worked together at the airport. I thought they would proceed without me and let me work things out on my own, but Tyler remained behind. He guided me through the procedure as if it were routine, showing me where to place my suitcase and how security operated. To anticipate on the aircraft, I was restlessly trying to ignore the shivers running up my back as we arrived at our gate. Had never flown before, so Tyler must have realized that even though I wasn't particularly afraid, I wasn't sure what to anticipate, because he gave me a shoulder bump and smile for the first time. It's okay, just chew gum while taking off, and if you feel strange, just concentrate on something stable, like the sea before you once again. I awaited the punchline, characteristic snark, but it never materialized because he was being kind when we got on the aircraft. Ethan even switched seats with me so he said, as if it were clear, that the view from the window is the greatest part of the first trip, so I may as well enjoy it. Wanted to inquire as to why they were behaving in this manner, but I refrained as this was the I let it, because I've always wanted to be treated as if I mattered and was a real part of anything. I gave myself a glimmer of hope that maybe this journey wouldn't be as horrible as I had thought. The shift in Chicago proceeded to incorporate me in their plans rather than either chatting over me or ignoring me. They asked me how I felt about the hotel's amenities, and Caleb asked if I wanted to see the rooftop pool. Instead of expecting I would find a seat on my own, they made sure I had one with them when we bought dinner. At the game, they didn't simply put up with my enthusiasm, they matched it. Then the thing that really confused me was when we were, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was a part of something genuine at the stadium because of the incredible vibe there. A man behind us began to get noisy at halftime. He had been annoying the whole game, but now I wasn't even looking at him when he abruptly decided that I was the one who was drinking and fighting with anybody within hearing. His speech was slurred, and I could smell the liquor even over the stadium food. Hey kid, you lost or something? Like a charity case, and before I could even respond, Ethan turned around and walked away. We were watching the game, the guy hissed, calm down, I'm only playing with him. Tyler seemed to be the odd one out, so maybe he was worried about your own seat before you're ejected from here. The man muttered something under his breath, but most likely looked away. I was shocked to see that he couldn't defeat 3 guys who weren't giving up. I had been prepared to simply ignore it to give the impression that I didn't care. But Ethan and Tyler immediately stepped in and spoke up for me. Ethan didn't eventually say what I'd been thinking until we were heading back to the hotel after the game. We haven't been good brothers to you, and you know that he began the journey with his hands stuffed in his pockets. We haven't been horrible, but we weren't really there either. I waited for our dad, who was polite, without saying anything. Ethan acknowledged that he made sure we maintained our distance from Jake, not in a don't talk to Jake sense, but whenever we approached, affected us, and as we've become older, we've come to see how unfair what I swallowed was. Although I had suspected it for years, having them confirm it left me unclear of what to do with the revelation. Ethan went on, "Loud made it real that we want to change that." I wasn't sure how to respond since this was something I had always desired, and I wasn't sure whether I could trust it, but in my heart I realized that I had always wanted them to see me as their brother, despite my best efforts to appear indifferent. When we returned home, I assumed that everything would return to normal, maybe for the first time. The vacation was just temporary and one-time, and once we resumed our normal schedules, my brothers would return to their regular behaviors, dismissing me and avoiding me as if I weren't a part of their universe. However, Tyler, who often pretended that I didn't exist, began to appear after I thought he was simply waiting for Caleb when he offered to drive me home after basketball sessions. But then Ethan began checking in as well, inquiring about my courses and really listening when he asked if I wanted to get some lunch on the way. Instead of nodding absently as he scrolled through his phone, I spoke to Caleb, who had always been the person who was quietest around me, began encouraging me to spend time in his room, where we would play video games and watch strange TV. Something significant, but it was apparent, and I wanted to think it was a genuine aspect of who I was. The same one that had held onto their Chicago's generosity gave me hope that people would really want to improve. But then Marcus, my closest buddy since middle school, once, after practice, he leaned against his locker and remarked, "School threw a wrench in that idea, dude." He usually had that smug expression when he felt he was onto something. "I'm glad for you, but are we certain you're brothers? I've been listening to you gripe about how you're not up to anything." So I scowled and said, "What are you talking about?" He shrugged. "After years of ignoring you, they are finally providing you with transportation, refreshments, and the opportunity to really speak to you." I wanted to dismiss him since he seemed like a suspicious guy, but individuals don't simply flip a switch like that for no reason. Stayed with me that evening, and I focused more on Tyler's speech pattern until he dropped me off at home. He inquired about Uncle Dave as well as about me, asking how his job was doing. Tyler asked informally as we pulled into the driveway while still making a number of trips. I shrugged. "Hoon is always busy." "That's fantastic." Tyler said that he probably knows a lot of people in the field since he often discusses his work. Although it was subtle, the way he pushed the discussion in Dave's direction made my stomach turn. It seemed practiced, as if he had prepared it, and then a few days later, the way he asked just enough without being overt. Later, I discovered evidence that Uncle Dave had visited after work, and while assisting my mother he left his laptop open on the dining table in the kitchen. I wasn't prying, but as I passed by, I saw the last candidates for the intern selection committee were frozen in place when I caught a glance of his email inbox and one of the subject lines "review," which made me gasp as I read it. He wasn't simply employed by any IT firm. He was on the selection committee for a significant internship program, rather than simply any internship that essentially guaranteed a high-paying job, then a golden ticket, and all of a sudden the timing made right. Shift in attitude, since they had been introducing me to discussions on Dave's work without attempting to correct it. I sat with that knowledge for a while. They weren't attempting to be better brothers. Instead, they were attempting to take advantage of me. For a long time, I felt foolish for ever thinking that things might be different in Chicago the way they had defended me, and when they referred to me as their brother, I had allowed myself to believe it to be true, but it was really a charade. A plan, and a few days later they took action. Tyler and Ethan were in the living room as I entered, and they leaning forward on the sofa, Ethan murmured, "Hey man," waving me over as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When I asked Dave about his job, I sometimes kept my face expressionless, which must be nice, Tyler said. "You must have amazing connections, particularly in that area," since he was stretching as if he was totally relaxed. They weren't outright asking yet, but they were testing the waters with their cautious, methodical approach, so I glanced at them. I felt sick to my stomach at the way they grinned, as if this were just another informal talk, showing no concern. About me that they never had, So I sat with the burden of it for the next several days, mentally reliving every exchange, the unexpected generosity and care. Them get away with it now that I understood what they wanted. I had to inform Uncle Dave the next. He must have sensed something was wrong since he didn't dismiss me or order me to wait when he first arrived. So I took him aside before he could go. Instead, he looked at me patiently, like he usually did when he sensed I had something important to say, like my brothers are attempting to take advantage of me, so I spoke quietly so that no one else could hear me. Dave's face didn't alter much, but I saw the little change in his stance and the way his lips moved slightly to indicate that he wasn't shocked, so I assumed he acknowledged that something was wrong. But you know what? I told him everything, and all of a sudden they began behaving as if I was their brother, and the way they sought to slither into discussions about his connections while always bringing up his work. Dave leaned back and laughed softly when I brought up his open email and the internship program. I was wondering when they would find it out, so I blinked, and you know I had a suspicion he acknowledged that Jake wasn't very subtle, and now that you're confirming it, we can be certain that he tapped his fingers. His attitude changed to one of amusement when he leaned on the counter for a bit. So what do you do? I narrowed my brows and said, you say we have a little fun with this. We play along, he continued. Just let's see how. I nodded carefully as I considered how far they're ready to go, and if they would treat me like an instrument to achieve their goals. Then maybe it was time for them to acknowledge that they weren't as cunning as they believed. Our tickets to another basketball game this past weekend were for a local game. It wasn't as exciting as the trip to Chicago, but it was the Uncle Dave made sure Tyler and Ethan was seated in the ideal, laid-back location where my brothers wouldn't expect anything. I've been overwhelmed, Guy. He let it go midway in the second quarter when I was close to him, and I witnessed him lay the trap. He recently mentioned stretching as if he were only striking up a conversation. My time is often consumed by internship season. I could tell by the change in my brother's body language that they have fallen for it, without even having to look at them. Tyler turned to him, playing it calm, and they instantly paid more attention. Oh, what type of internships? With a nonchalant shrug, Dave mentioned tech-related topics. My firm offers this program for high school and college students. Funded internship, makes excellent contacts, and if you succeed, you essentially have a job after graduation. I almost chuckled at how Ethan attempted to act nonchalant, which sounds incredibly fascinating, and Tyler said something, but their looks quickly altered. Dave cocked an eyebrow, saying, "Oh, you guys never mentioned that before." Ethan nodded. "I've always been interested in it. In a nutshell, Dad did push us in different directions, don't you think?" Dave said, extending the sentence just enough to demonstrate that he wasn't duped. "If you're serious about it, I do affect the program in some way." And that was all it took for them to get engrossed a few days after the Uncle Dave put the last piece of the plan into action by inviting my brothers to his home for a basketball game. Arranged a meeting to discuss the internship possibility, but instead of simply inviting them, he also invited their father. I knew this was going to be huge as soon as I heard it, and when we got to Dave's home, everything was prepared to feel official. He had a laptop open with some paperwork opened up, a notebook, and many files on the coffee table. Ethan and Tyler wore somewhat finer clothes next to him, as if he were treating this as seriously as if it were a genuine interview. Often sat up straight and tried their hardest to project professionalism for their father, Mark. Seemed content, as if he had already concluded that this was a done deal. Dave reclined in his chair and began with a pleasant grin. "Thank you for attending. This program is important, and we don't accept anybody without strong moral principles, leadership abilities, and above all, honesty and familial devotion." Ethan and Tyler and Ethan nodded rapidly, attempting to avoid seeming very excited. "Of course," Ethan said. "We completely understand that we've always been about." Tyler said, "That's really important to us, family." Their father, who was seated next to them, nodded in agreement. He mentioned how I brought kids up and that they recognize the value of watching out for one another. I almost rolled my eyes. It's wonderful to learn that Dave's grin had a deeper meaning since it was a part of the final decision. Procedure includes feedback from your closest friends, family, and greatest acquaintances. We want to hear authentic tales. He gave me a knowing glance as he spoke about your character, Jake. I believe it would be fantastic if... Thing, which makes sense given Mark, who had been sitting pleasantly up until now, abruptly turned rigid. Throughout all of their journeys with their father days his face remained the same, but I could sense a change in his body language as he leaned forward and met Mark's eyes. Dave responded, tilting his head, "Oh, well," and Ethan swallowed hard for a little while before turning to face Tyler and Ethan. I kept my tone light and almost casual, even though they never asked me. I understand that they had I wasn't really involved in it, but I did remain at home when they were on their trip, and that was usually nice. Mark's face became completely white as I realized it, and the ensuing stillness was so oppressive that I could see how Ethan and Tyler suddenly seemed as if they wanted to curl up on the sofa, mimicking their dad's uncomfortable shifting in his. Dave tightened his jaw and allowed the paw to stretch for a few agonizing seconds before his whole attitude transformed to one of friendliness. His voice strengthened and confirmed that the room was well filled with his warm grin. He remarked, snapping the laptop shut in front of him, confirming that Tyler and Ethan had given him a glance. Their father's head shot up in astonishment, and Mark questioned in a strained, calm voice, "What do you mean?" Dave sighed. He shook his head, indicating that this discussion was done and that Tyler and Ethan were no longer eligible. As they waited in their seats, Tyler blurted out that honesty and family values were important factors. Dave's tone, he stared straight at Mark, whom you instructed them to, and what I just saw tells me all I need to know. It's chilly now. They have distanced themselves from their own brother, and now that they are in need of anything, they are acting amiably, which isn't. Ethan's cheeks became pale, but that's not what this is. We were serious about this day phase. Integrity, that's manipulation, was so serious about it that he laughed without amusement. Tell me what projects have you worked on? What programming languages are you skilled in? And how much cybersecurity expertise do you have? There was no response from either software development or cloud computing, so the stillness continued, and this time I wasn't the one who felt uncomfortable. Mark cleared his throat at last, and Dave told him not to be too hurried since they are wonderful kids. And I'm sure we can. There is nothing to work out, so Dave cut him off. I don't provide or reward dishonesty. Opportunity to those who just consider family when it suits them. Ethan and Tyler seemed to Mark, who was obviously humiliated, rose up with a stiff face and a clenched jaw, but he chose not to disagree. He mumbled, gesturing for his sons to follow him, knowing they had lost Letton. Ethan paused, looking at he seemed to want to say something, but he ran out of things to say, so they got up and departed. When the door closed behind them, their shoulders slumped and their cheeks burned with shame. There was stillness for a while. It was no longer heavy, it seemed lighter. Dave sat back in his chair and gave me a good look, grinning a little. That was enjoyable, and I felt a sense of relief when I finally accepted that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one. Uncle Dave wasn't simply a good working man. He had genuine feelings, and the fallout was immediate. Impact, having worked in the field for many years, he had solid connections and had the type of reputation that individuals trusted. So when rumors began to circulate that Tyler and Ethan were trying to sway an internship, it wasn't like Dave went about disparaging them. Doors began to close for them before they ever had an opportunity to knock. Them on purpose, but when recruiters and hiring managers contacted him, they did so because that's how people communicate in these situations. He was honest when he said that these two young guys had shown bad character by using their own brother for their own advantage, who had only feigned morality when they believed it would help them. And that was plenty. They sent applications for internships, but each one slipped through their fingers. Some firms that had first shown excitement about their resumes suddenly stopped being interested. Ethan and Tyler quickly understood their destiny in it once it unexpectedly stopped responding. Mark had spent years shaping, and their father was furious that the one they had attempted to scam their way into wasn't occurring. People into his definition of success, encouraging them to do things upon which he could claim credit, And now because of their he made calls in an attempt to salvage things after they publicly disgraced themselves. Get favors from individuals he knew, but nothing worked. Individuals remember such things, so the more irate he became, as the situation at home worsened, Tyler and Ethan had to cope with more than simply the fallout from their own behavior. Passive-aggressive conduct that demonstrated their unwillingness to accept responsibility for whatever they saw in me as the issue, as if I had somehow manipulated them into revealing their actual selves, but I no longer gave a damn. I had allowed myself to feel like the outsider for years, the one who was insufficient and had to watch in quiet as they lived their lives apart from me, and I had devoted a lot of time to trying to figure out why I was never accepted and why I was never good. Enough for them to give a damn, and I finally come to the conclusion that they decided to be this way rather than me being the issue. And I was done having them make me feel tiny. The big surprise, however, came from my mom. She had always been silent when it came to Mark, never meddling and usually letting him deal with my brothers. But this time she didn't. Keep quiet. Perhaps she had now realized how he had brought them up and how he had urged them to regard me as. Perhaps she became aware of how much she had forgotten and how much she had let to occur in front of her without ever stepping in. Or maybe she had finally realized what type of guy Mark was after all these years, since I heard her tell him it was over in the kitchen, sounds late at night, just after everything had blown up. I didn't hear every word, but I heard enough of the fight, which was low but sharp and even reverberated through the walls. She stated, "I let you decide what family meant, and I let you push Jake out of it, which should have ended this long ago." Mark's voice was tight with fury, and I was mistaken. "You're being theatrical, no," she shot back. "I'm finally seeing things for what they are, and I'm finished." A few weeks later, Mark left, returning to his life without us. The home seemed different for the first time in years, with less tension that had always pervaded just after the surface disappeared. My mother began to speak with me more and inquired about my life and my desires, although she didn't. Ethan and Tyler still despised me, so that wasn't going to change, but for the first time, I was able to miraculously repair everything. I didn't care at the moment since I wasn't the issue they were, but now they had to deal with it for a while. Life began to seem different months after everything came apart, not just because of changes at home, but I no longer considered myself to be the extra child, the one abandoned when my brothers were away. Lovely little lives, and I wasn't the one who had given up on ever being treated like I mattered by someone. Things that would never occur, so I was anticipating what would happen next, and Uncle Dave then handed one evening, as we were hanging out at his apartment, he took out his laptop and switched on, which surprised me. I looked at the screen and felt my breath catch as he remarked, "There's something I want you to see." Website for one of the largest basketball camps in the nation that offers competitive training in addition to summer programs. The type of environment where youngsters were recognized and where careers began. A camp where scouts and coaches searched for genuine talent. Looked at him, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. "Is this real?" Dave grinned, and I've already spoken to her. Couldn't say anything, but I believe you should take a minute. There's an available slot, and I know a person who helps run it. The one thing that was mine and gave me a sense of control was basketball, which had always been my escape. Over anything, but I had never allowed myself to dream about it or considered it to be anything more than a passion, becoming something more, and Dave gave me an opportunity to make that happen. "You don't have to make a decision right immediately," he added. "However, I believe you should go for it since I saw a future for the first time and didn't need time to figure out my response. That wasn't influenced by my brother's actions or what I was losing out on. Instead, it was mine. In the meanwhile, the distance between us had become irreversible, and Ethan and Tyler had cut me off entirely, seldom mentioning me when they have to be in the same rooms, since Mark had completely vanished from my life, which was probably best because he was the only one. Caleb was still hovering about the boundaries, but he wasn't like Tyler and Ethan. Instead, he had followed their lead, sure, but he had never been so aloof and contemptuous, and now that they were gone, one day after practice, he waited for me outside the gym, perhaps uncertain of our position, so I adjusted my back and added, "I'm going to this camp. He paused, kicking at the pavement as if he was having trouble finding. Finally, he remarked, "I think it's cool," and I nodded. The proper words, however, he continued softly. I wasn't sure if I wanted to let him back in. I know things got messed up. I sighed after closely examining him. Not in the sense I had hoped, and as I departed for camp, I sensed something I had never felt, like I wasn't bearing the burden of being the forgotten one and wasn't looking to others for acceptance. Who would never believe in me, but I got genuine support from someone who did so because he wanted to, and a few weeks after Ethan and Tyler's wedding, I realized for the first time in my life how much I was worth. Uncle called me when I was getting used to my new life at basketball camp after I was unable to get any internships. "They're suing us," Dave, who almost caused me to drop my phone, exclaimed in a voice that was a mixture of incredulity, and he explained to me, "What are your brothers and their father?" I perched on the edge of my bed, laughing, and gripped my phone harder. "They filed a lawsuit against us both and are seeking $2 million. I chuckled and assumed he was kidding. I didn't think this was true, but he gave me the court records, and there they were. Mark, Ethan, and Tyler had formally filed a complaint, alleging that their career had suffered irreversible harm and severe hardship. Prospects claimed that I had tricked them into thinking we were brothers in order to. I had to read it again to be sure I wasn't having hallucinations when they said that I would degrade them and destroy their futures. Controlled them by asking in a stern, disbelieving voice, and they ignored me throughout my life. I didn't force them to act like good brothers, did something on their own initiative when they believed it would help them. Dave laughed dryly. "I know. Youngster, but according to their account of events, you evidently planned some kind of grandiose emotional fraud that tricked them into being devoted to you as siblings so you could later expose them." I replied, "Oh, it gets better," and Dave added, "They say you used psychological trying to get them to say things that were embarrassing." I rubbed my temples while leaning back against the wall. According to Dave, they want a court to accept that they were the genuine deal, even if they claim that it wasn't their fault. Victims here. I was speechless and unable to comprehend the sheer craziness of what was taking on, and they weren't just denying to accept accountability, they attempted to distort truth, and the worst thing a judge had done was Judge Gloria McMillan, who was well known in the legal community for her fairness, consented to hear the case. From what I've heard, she was empathetic but tough, and didn't put up with time-wasting or absurd statements that made it even more puzzling that she'd have consented to allow this case to continue. When we got to the courtroom, for when I first saw her at the preliminary hearing, she seemed to be an elderly lady, maybe in her late 60s, with keen eyes, and as the clerk gave out the case data, I saw a look that said, "I've seen everything and I'm tired of it all." When I caught a glance of her face, she seemed physically worn out, but also as if she had lost a little something. More confidence in people. I didn't blame her, but I kept expecting the case to be dismissed right away, which was absurd, because Ethan and Tyler couldn't handle the repercussions. It was humiliating and a last-ditch effort to change history. Of their own decisions, but the fact that we were in a courtroom at all indicated that, for the time being at least, we had to take it seriously. I looked at them. Ethan was sitting rigidly in his suit, attempting to seem calm, but I could tell Tyler shifted next to him, periodically looking at his father, who was looking straight ahead, due to the strain in his jaw, moving forward in the same inflexible, self-righteous stance he usually maintained. They weren't come to seek justice. Instead, they were. The courthouse was crowded on the day I came for retribution, and for the first time in my life, I no longer felt afraid of them. On the first day of the trial, it was no longer just a routine court case. Rather, it had evolved into a grand show. Bloggers and influencers had their phones ready in real time, while journalists crowded the gallery, anticipating a weird headline, tweeting every absurd detail, and some of my former classmates even attended because they were so fascinated by the case's craziness. I could hear the audience's hardly disguised laughing as Uncle Dave and I entered the room. It wasn't simply said, "Ethan and Tyler sued me because of the ridiculous way they presented their case, which prevented anybody from assisting them." However, he was captivated before the actual performance started. He was the first to rise, and before he even spoke, he burst down in tears, not the silent type, but the noisy kind. Someone who had rehearsed in front of a mirror sobbed dramatically, choking out the whole process between "My life has been ruined by sniffles. I wake up every morning terrified, and now he before striking his last blow." Was evidence of Judge McMillan, who had evidently seen everything throughout her decades on the bench, breathe the harm that Jake had inflicted. "Please explain gently." Tyler fixed his tie while staring at the jurors like he was in a high-stakes game one evening. "I was attempting to further my profession as a teacher while I was grieving the emotional damage caused by Jake's deception. I had the abilities, but I lost my hold on my laptop because of the unbearable despair brought on by his treachery." There was a prolonged pause until a guy in the second row whispered loudly enough for others to hear, so he dropped it, causing a few giggles to reverberate across the audience, but Tyler remained sullen, and his voice broke. Judge McMillan gripped the bridge of her nose and let her breathe heavily, exactly as in my nightmares. Exhaled slowly, but Mark, ever the opportunist, got up because he wasn't going to let his kids steal the show. His voice echoed throughout the room as he smirked confidently and said, "Your Honor, I think justice dictates." The court stenographer turned to look at Jake as he gave me half of his child support money. Judge McMillan blinked and clasped his hands together as if he were making the most sensible gesture. "I apologize, Mark. I've been providing for my boys financially for years, so it's only right that they've lost their employment chances. Jake should be required to share his father's trust money since we are all family." After all, someone in the back murmured, "Did this guy just ask for child support?" As a loud snort erupted from the gallery. From a young age, the courtroom was virtually alive with uncontrollably loud laughing, even from the guy who served as the bailiff, who had most likely heard every absurd justification under the sun, seemed to want to go, and then it was our time. Uncle Dave stayed composed and carried a tiny speaker to the front. He nodded courteously to the judge before "We just need to be kind to him for a little bit," because when we hit play, Ethan and Tyler's voices filled the courtroom. Ethan's voice replied, crystal clear, and Tyler added, "I think we actually care." He believes that when we get Dave to submit a recommendation, we'll be set. The courtroom became quiet on the prosecution's side. Tyler's face had gone a deep shade of crimson. Mark looked like he wanted to melt into his chair, and Ethan was holding onto the table so tightly that his knuckles became white. Dave let the tape to finish before turning to Judge McMillan, nodded slowly, her expression impassive, "And I would want to present this as evidence." Put into evidence, our lawyer got to his feet with a little grin on his face, and he switched up the projector, and the courtroom screen came to life. "Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence to offer." Came up with a snapshot of a Google search, showing the red search box at the top with instructions on how to find a job if you're not sure what a Tyler Carter, the author of the search, uses a computer. I had never seen a judge sobbing and rubbing her temples before, but Judge McMillan did just that, and the audience burst into laughter as reporters quickly typed. Some influencers enthusiastically murmured into their phones while live broadcasting this disaster onto their desktops. As the prosecution had run out of options, Ethan continued to attempt to maintain his dignity by burying his face in his hands. Slumping back in his chair, as if he had already come to terms with his destiny, Mark seemed entirely Judge McMillan. Unable to speak, removed her spectacles and set them on her desk. "I believe we've heard enough today." Although the trial was not yet formally completed, everyone there was aware of the verdict, and I leaned back in my chair and grinned for the first time since this disaster began because, despite their best efforts to twist the courtroom, was rapidly devolving into complete anarchy as reality, the truth finally prevailed, and Judge Gloria Millen was clearly having difficulty keeping things organized. She was an experienced lady who had probably throughout her tenure, she presided over hundreds of ridiculous cases, yet each one was trying her patience to the breaking point. Ethan, Tyler, and Mark somehow made their predicament worse in the midst of the moment, and Ethan is still riding the wave of self-pity entered the stand once again, his face solemn as if he were about to give the most heartbreaking testimony. Of the century, he dramatically straightened his tie, gazed across the courtroom, and let out a deep sigh after he started speaking in a theatrically grieving tone, and I knew that my hopes of working in it had been gone. If an internship can be taken away from me so quickly, then education is a sham. What good is learning? Put his hands stoically on the stand while glancing around the courtroom in anticipation of nods of agreement. Judge McMillan's eyebrows tightened. Having too much tolerance, beyond reason, who had previously been put to the test, sighed the longest and most worn out of her career magic, repeating as if she effing nodded sincerely in agreement, finding it hard to believe that she was saying such things in a formal court process. Since Jake deceived us and ruined our futures, I have determined that the only authentic information remaining unless you're saying that, Judge McMillan stroked her temples, Mr. Carter. This planet is found in old magical arts. The defendant cursed you, but I didn't understand how this related to the case. Ethan paused, I think. The crowd burst into laughter once again, as if I had been cursed, but before the judge could recover control, Tyler made the decision it was his moment to shine, and he approached the situation with a very serious demeanor after taking something from his briefcase. He'd proudly displayed a handcrafted comic book that he said was his Uncle Dave's broken dream, caused him to move in his seat, hardly suppressing a smile, even for our lawyer, who had been keeping Judge McMillan's professional poise throughout the morning, allowed him to laugh softly. But Mr. Carter was already worn out. Tyler played the comic book on the table, revealing its hand-drawn pages in a dramatic opening. What is that he spoke in an emotional way about a hero called Future Tech Mogul, a guy who would transform the world with his inventions and create the greatest technological empire of our time. A guy who Judges McMillan held up a hand, and I'm going to assume that the hero is before Jake stole everything away from me. Tyler nodded seriously. At this point, a loud snort sounded from the rear of the room, followed by quiet giggles. But Tyler kept frantically turning the pages. I'll never fulfill my destiny. This desire and this legacy have been completely ruined. Judge McMillan's countenance had now crystallized into pure joy as the courtroom shook with hardly contained laughter. Disbelief gazed at him for a while before gesturing for him to return to his seat without uttering a word. This point Mark made it apparent that he needed to take back control of the circus that his sons owned, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke to the judge in a tone that had transformed this trial into I want to take a minute to address a guy who thought he was going to make a fantastic legal case, Your Honor. Although a lot of people in this room are laughing, the true problem is that my boys were reared with integrity, discipline, and strong morals, and I can demonstrate this by evaluating McMillan to see how well he was done. Do you want to demonstrate that Mark confidently went into his bag, took out a book, and held it up as if the laughing that followed was no longer quiet, because the holy text had now been revealed. It was parenting for fools. There was complete, uncontrollable anarchy, whether it was whispers or suppressed laughter. One of the reporters had to wipe away tears from her eyes on the bailiff, who had miraculously kept a straight face the whole time, but Judge McMillan had to look away to restore his composure. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and then exhaled gently. Are you really trying to use parenting for dummies as a legal defense? Mark placed, she said, gritting her teeth. The book on the table as if it were a piece of concrete proof. It helped me navigate parenting, and I did what it said. Lessons, and my boys did well. If they didn't, it wasn't my parenting style. Before the judge could even respond, a chuckle broke out due to Jake's deceit, and then, just when I thought the absurdity of this day reached a breaking point, our attorney took the stage and struck the ultimate blow. Your Honor, he replied, attempting to maintain his composure in spite of the ridiculousness of the circumstance. Before we wrap up for the day, I'd want he went to the front, took out a tablet, and hit play on a video in order to provide one more piece of proof. A video from TikTok appeared on the courthouse screen, and Ethan and Tyler were dressed in embarrassing attire. They pointed at floating while dancing badly to a popular music, while wearing sunglasses and outfits that were obviously 2 sizes too large. The courtroom erupted when the phrase on the screen read, "We are the future of it." People were hunched over in their chairs, unable to breathe, and one reporter even dropped her notebook, trembling. The stenographer's hands were frozen over the keyboard, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she had officially given up laughing. "We're done for today," Judge McMillan remarked, taking off her spectacles and massaging her temples. Her voice was filled with Ethan and Tyler sat still in their chairs, their cheeks blazing as if the tea court was postponed until tomorrow. There was still laughing all around them, and as Uncle Dave and I left the courtroom, I became aware of something. There and for years, I thought it was my fault. I thought maybe if I tried harder, if I proved myself, if I made myself smaller when I needed to or bigger, when I could then maybe one day they would see me the way I had always seen them. I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. But what I learned, what I had to learn the hard way, is that some people only see you when they need something from you. And those people are not family, they are opportunist. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. I could see people nodding, some leaning forward in their seats, others exchanging quiet glances. They understood my brothers, pretended to care about me, not because they suddenly realized I was worth knowing, but because they thought I could help them get ahead. And when I saw through it, when I refused to be used, they tried to rewrite reality itself. They tried to make me the villain in their story, because they couldn't handle the fact that for the first time in their lives, they had to face real consequences for their actions. I let out a small chuckle, shaking my head, and the best part, I failed so spectacularly that the entire world got front row, even though I have felt helpless around my brothers for years. I took seats to watch laughter reverberate throughout the crowd. Standing here now, I realized just how far I had come. They had spent their entire lives convinced they were untouchable, that their actions had no consequences, and now they were a joke, they were a cautionary tale. And I was the one standing here telling the story what happened to them. After the trial, I Compton, my voice steady well. It turns out the internet has a long memory that mean how to get into it without knowing what a computer is. That spread like wildfire. It became so popular that companies started using it in their onboarding presentations as a joke about hiring standards. Job recruiters started recognizing their names before they even walked into an interview. And let's just say that applications weren't exactly welcomed. Every major tech company in the area blacklisted them. Their father's business collapsed, because it turns out clients don't want to be associated with the man responsible for one of the most embarrassing legal cases in recent history. A few people in the audience laughed again, but this time it wasn't just amusement, it was recognition. They knew people like my brothers, they had seen this kind of entitlement before, and now they were seeing what happened when it finally backfired. I took a deep breath, my expression softening. But this isn't just about them, it's about what happens when you realize that the people you've spent your life waiting on, waiting for validation, waiting for recognition, were never going to give it to you. And that's okay, because once you stop waiting, you get to start living for yourself. The audience was silent now, not out of boredom, but because they were listening, really listening. People will try to use you, I said. They will try to manipulate you, guilt you, convince you that you owe them something just because you share DNA. But family isn't about obligation, it's about choice. And I chose to walk away. I let the words settle before finally concluding. And the moment I did, my life became my own. The applause was immediate, loud, and full of something I hadn't expected. Respect, not just for what I had been through, but for what I had become. I stepped back from the microphone feeling lighter than I ever had before. I had spent years thinking that my worth depended on my brothers, seeing me on my mother, stepping in on my family, choosing me. But standing there under those bright lights, I realized the truth. I had never needed them. I had only ever needed myself. In the months that followed, life seemed to move forward for everyone except for Ethan, Tyler, and Mark, who were now permanently trapped in the wreckage of their own making. Their reputations were beyond saving, their career prospects non-existent, and their last-ditch efforts to escape their humiliation only made things worse at some point. The brothers must have realized that their names had become so toxic that getting a job anywhere in the country was impossible, so in an act of pure desperation they decided that the only option left was to leave the country entirely and start over somewhere new. The problem, they were just as incompetent at running away as they were at everything else. One morning news broke that two young men had been detained at an airport after accidentally purchasing tickets to an airline simulator instead of an actual flight. The story quickly went viral. Apparently, Ethan and Tyler had seen an unbelievable deal for international travel experience tickets and jumped on it thinking they had found a loophole to escape their problems. They didn't realize their mistake until they had already gone through security only to be escorted into a windowless training facility where airline trainees practiced emergency landings and turbulent scenarios. The internet exploded with laughter. Every news outlet covered the story, and once the full details came out, it was even worse for them. Not only had they failed to leave the country, but their blunder had now solidified them as the poster children for failure. Meanwhile, Mark, still desperately clinging to whatever scraps of credibility he had left, decided that he could rebrand himself as a parenting expert. His big plan, a book titled How to Raise Successful Children, while he tried to spin his disastrous experience into a guide for other parents. Unfortunately for him, nobody was buying it literally or figuratively. The book flopped so hard that bookstores refused to stock it, and the only copies that ended up selling were purchased by people who wanted it as a gag gift. Every attempt they made to rewrite their narrative only pushed them deeper into infamy. As for me, my life was finally going in the direction I had always dreamed of. Not long after my TEDx talk, I received the news that I had been awarded a full sport for scholarship to one of the top universities in the country. The moment I saw the acceptance letter, I realized that everything I had ever needed was finally in front of me. I wasn't just getting out, I was getting out on my terms, with my future built on my own achievements, not on waiting for approval from people who never cared about me. The night before I left for college, I sat on my bed, staring at my packed bags, and thought about how different things had been just a year ago. I remembered all the times my brothers had ignored me, dismissed me, acted like I wasn't even worth an acknowledging. I remembered the trips they took without me, the way they treated me, like I was nothing more than an outsider in my own home. And then I smiled, because in the end they were wrong. I had found my real family not in them, but in the people who had truly cared about me. Uncle Dave, my friends, the people who had believed in me when no one else did. I had built something real for myself, something that had nothing to do with their approval, and for the first time I was completely, undeniably free. So what do you all think? Have you ever had family members try to manipulate you like this? How would you have handled the situation? And most importantly, if you had to give Ethan and Tyler one final piece of advice, what would it be? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling this is a story people won't forget anytime soon.